Welcome to the Prodigy Maker Show with Chris Lewit. Chris Lewit is an internationally recognized high-performance coach, educator, and author of 2 best-selling books, The Tennis Technique Bible and The Secrets of Spanish Tennis. The show can be watched live, and video versions of the show are archived at youtube.com/Chris Lewit. And now, here's Chris.
So, Chris, why don't you just give me your full name and how you want to be identified in the story?
My name's Chris Lewit, Lewit, and I am the author of The Secrets of Spanish Tennis and a high-performance coach here in the U.S. I work with a lot of top juniors in the U.S.
And where do you do that?
I'm based I have a club. I'm a tennis club owner in Manchester, Vermont, which is in the northeast of the U.S. And I coach for 20 years in New York City. I still coach in New York City as well.
Great. So I was interested in talking to you because of the book you wrote. I'm a tennis fan as well, and I've been intrigued by the very quick rise of Alcaraz, but also just more generally, I'm interested in what you wrote about. So what is it that distinguishes the way that Spanish players are being trained and how they play?
Yeah, I figured you were a tennis fan. I've done a lot of these interviews actually with different journalists. So with Alcaraz, well, let's talk about Spanish tennis. The main secrets of Spanish tennis, what I always share, the general aspect is, number one, there's 6 aspects. Number one, they are very good movers. So they specifically train footwork and movement in Spain to the highest level. They're famous for that. They have great movers. They have great footwork. Number 2, they are very consistent players. In Spain, they value consistency and steadiness. So they're well known for developing players who don't make a lot of errors. Alcaraz is a little bit outside of the norm in that respect. He goes for broke a bit more. He's a little more erratic than the Spanish players who came before him, the champions, but we can talk about that. Number 3, they develop. They have a system for developing a big forehand weapon. So they have typically Spanish players have a tremendous forehand weapon. So that is a big part of their development model there in Spain. Number 4, they are very well known for their defense. They develop great defensive players. So not only offense, particularly with the forehand, but they have good defensive movement, good defensive capabilities. That's a big part of the Spanish way. And number 5, in Spain, part of the system is the physicality. They have wonderful trainers and physios and strength and conditioning coaches, and they develop players who are just indefatigable. They never fatigue, they never quit, and they have tremendous endurance. Endurance is a very important concept and word in Spain. Related to that is number 6, the 6th pillar is their capacity to suffer. In Spain, they have a philosophy about suffering, which is really fascinating to discuss and investigate, just going deep into their culture. But in their tennis culture, they believe in teaching suffering. They believe in developing the capacity to suffer. That was a major chapter in my book. And that's related to their physical strength and their physical endurance. So all the young players in Spain are taught to suffer on the tennis court, which if you're not from Spain may sound a little odd or strange, but they really do believe that wholeheartedly. And it's a big part of their philosophy and culture in the tennis culture in Spain. And also, to some extent, the culture itself. The whole country suffered under Franco for many years. So a big part of Spanish tennis is the willingness and developing the capacity to suffer.
That's interesting. I mean, the last 2 that you mentioned almost have to do with a mentality, right? Like how you approach the competition.
Absolutely. And not only related to that, and there's a number of offshoots and segues, but related to that is they're known for being incredibly hard workers. Just on a fundamental basis, the Spanish players probably train harder than any other country. Maybe that's changing now because all the other countries are trying to adapt in the last, let's say, several decades to compete with Spain. And it's interesting to note that many countries are succeeding. Italy, for example, is doing very well now. And in many respects, the Spanish model has been copied and proliferated all across the world in the last couple of decades. It's an interesting trend. They're all trying to compete. All these countries are trying to compete at the highest level. And Spain was the top dog for many years, and now they have strong competition. The U.S. is doing very well also.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to go back to the 6 pillars you mentioned. I mean, I think it's interesting, you know, the things that you mentioned, like the forehand weapon, the footwork. I mean, these are things that you know, as someone, you know, I play recreationally, and I've got a son who's a junior player now here in Germany.
Cool.
I mean, these are things that are sort of instilled, I think, in many places, right? Like footwork is obviously a huge thing, but is there something that, you know, the Spaniards are doing, you know, that make it distinctive, like
yes.
that you know what I mean, like I mean, because everyone teaches all these things in some respect, right?
Yeah, but I guess you go back to the history of Spain. It goes back the change started in maybe 1970s, and then the early 1980s. There were 2 famous coaches in Spain, the legends, the grandfathers, the godfathers of Spanish tennis, Luis Bruguera and Pato Alvarez, William Pato Alvarez. Unfortunately, William Pato Alvarez passed away last year. Very sad, but these figures were monumental in Spanish tennis. And to your question, the guy, William Pato Alvarez, fascinating character, very eccentric, brilliant. Luis Bruguera is also quite eccentric and brilliant. The 2 of them are powerful forces in Spanish tennis. And that's one of the theses in my book. You know, those 2 figures transformed Spanish tennis. And what William Pato Alvarez created was this system for training footwork. And he was obsessed with footwork, and he was a fan of ballroom dancing. And he developed this method of drills, mainly drills from baskets. And sometimes in Spain they call them cubos, like these buckets of balls. And there are these series of geometric drills and movements that can be linked together. It's a great system. I've studied in the system for a long time, and I use it with my players. But basically it works a lot of the in and out movements on the court, back and forth, defense, offense, and it teaches players to move impeccably well with balance and precision. And so one of the unique aspects of Spanish tennis was this system, like this literal training system that Pato Alvarez just created out of thin air in the 1970s, more or less. And the whole country saw the success of Pato Alvarez with his students like Emilio Sanchez and Sergio Casal and a number of other top players on the tour. And the whole country basically copied the method of Pato Alvarez, and then subsequently Luis Bruguera with all of his success, who had a similar system but with some variation. And the entire country adopted these methods, and that's one of the way that they build great movers. And also playing on the red clay helps the movement too. Some other countries also have red clay, but it's this movement and footwork system of Pato Alvarez that was really the gem of Spain that made their movement training special.
So he would set up these cubos like kind of in a pattern, in a geometric pattern, and he would have his players kind of. It was almost like an obstacle course. Is that what you're talking about?
No, the drills were like he's famous for developing the X pattern. So the X is a very famous drill in Spain, and now it's all over the world. Everyone's copied it, but he created the X, which is basically you move back to hit a forehand, and then you move forward maybe to hit a backhand along one half of the X, and then you might move back to hit a backhand and then forward to hit a forehand, and you just this is endless repetitions of X patterns around the court. Sometimes X pattern behind the baseline, sometimes X pattern in the midcourt or at the net, and it's a beautiful system, and it links together. And what Pato Alvarez did was sometimes he would link the exercises together for hundreds of balls. He was famous for working players into the ground to make them suffer through 100 balls in a row, 200, 300 balls, 3 cubos in a row, and that's how he would build stamina, which I mentioned was very, very important in Spain, endurance, and also the capacity to suffer. And at the same time, the system developed this movement and balance. So that drilling method is at the heart of Spanish tennis. And Luis Bruguera is a little bit younger, maybe 10 years younger than Pato Alvarez, more or less. And he also developed a similar system. So the two of those guys, in my opinion, are fundamentally responsible for the whole revolution in Spain, going back to the 70s and 80s. They're very powerful they're very dynamic individuals, they through their own passion, and a coach can transform a country, especially a small country. And those two guys, with their passion and drive and dedication, they transform the country almost single-handedly. Of course, there are other characters and forces, but.
And it's interesting. I mean, you see that. I mean, that obsession and concentration on footwork. You see that on display every time Nadal is. Whenever there's a coin flip, the other guy's just usually sitting around waiting for the coin flip, and Nadal is he's bouncing around, and he does not stop. I mean, he's constantly doing these kind of shuffles back and forth, and Alcaraz does that as well. And it's interesting because there's something going on there that other players aren't even bothering doing before the match.
Yeah, part of that is just their individual characteristics, their personalities, but they both exemplify the warrior nature of Spanish tennis players. They both demonstrate they're both willing to suffer till the end, and Nadal probably more exemplifies that in his career more than any Spanish player. He's just he's the greatest Spanish player ever. Alcaraz is wonderful, but he has not nearly close to what Nadal has done in his career. And those two guys that's typical. They're great role models and great examples of what they teach in Spain in different aspects. But the mentality, the energy, the willingness to chase every ball and fight. When you're playing a Spanish player, it's going to be a long day at the office because they never give up, they never tire, and they're going to fight you all the way to the end. They're great soldiers, great warriors.
Now, has this produced quantifiable results? I mean, I know that that's a dumb question because obviously it has, but I'm just wondering, have you measured the results of this since the 70s, since, Alvarez started, teaching some of this stuff, and Bruguera as well, and looking, throughout the last few decades, have Spanish players, won more, top ATP tournament matches and things like that?
Yeah, I don't think there's been many scientific studies, but there's been lots of, statistics thrown around. So I was just looking through my first book, The Secrets of Spanish Tennis, to refresh my memory as well. I have if you could mention also in your piece, the new Secrets of Spanish Tennis second edition, fully updated, all new chapters, is coming out at the end of the summer, early fall this year. So that would be great to mention.
Oh, great. So I would imagine you're going to be talking about Alcaraz in that book.
That was a big part of the update, is we have a new chapter on Alcaraz and his history and how he was developed. And just there's many new chapters, including new features of different coaches in Spain and new history. But what I mentioned in my book was, for example, in 1973, there were only 2 Spaniards in the top 50. It was Manuel Orantes and Andres Jimeno. And by 2011, there were... when you get into the 2000s, Spain had as many as 15 players in the top hundreds. The level of players in the top 100 in the world typically fluctuated between 10 and 15 Spanish players. I think they're around 10 now. I'd have to check the recent statistics. You can check it too.
That's actually pretty phenomenal, given that how small of a country Spain is, relatively speaking.
Basically, the last few decades, they've fluctuated between 10 and 15 players in the ATP Top 100. And this was a country that in the early 1970s only had two players in the top 50. Orantes and Jimeno were the top players in Spain during that time period. And in the 60s, there was a guy, Manuel or Manolo Santana, who was the great champion of Spain. And it's the history there is fascinating because Franco was a big tennis fan, and he loved Santana. And Franco put a lot of money, investment into growing the game of tennis in Spain at the club level, more at the grassroots level. And so in many ways, the dictator Franco holds some responsibility for the growth of tennis in Spain. He thought it was a great sport for the masses to play.
Right.
And he was very proud of the success of Santana in the 60s. Santana was the great champion for Spain. He won the French Open in 1961 and 64, and he won the U.S. Open in 1965, and he won Wimbledon in 1966. So at that time, this is really, for a small country, he was an amazing figure and Franco felt that the whole population, they revered him, and he felt that tennis could be a great sport just for the country, all the people. So he wanted to make investments all over the country in tennis clubs and facilities and to growing the game. And those investments, a few decade or two later, paid off, and there was a huge tennis boom in Spain. It's fascinating.
That's fascinating. I didn't know that history of that. So, yeah, I mean, like any effective dictator, he sees a sports star and he's thinking, this guy's getting famous. I gotta hitch my cart onto this horse.
Yeah, he was really proud of Santana, and Santana was big news in the country, and he felt tennis would be a great, healthy sport for the average people.
Yeah, exactly.
It
suits the Spanish climate. You can set up a bunch of courts.
So that's in the 60s and early 70s, and Franco left power, I believe, 1975. So that's kind of the timeline. And then Pato Alvarez just happened to move to Spain around that time from Colombia, and then Luis Bruguera was working in the trenches around that time as well. And then by the 1980s, that's when Spanish tennis started to rise and take off. That's really the root. That's the roots of the modern Spanish success. It's really interesting history, actually.
Pato Alvarez, where was his base of operations?
I believe he moved directly to Barcelona. Those two coaches were Barcelona coaches, and that's in the center of tennis, the heart of tennis in Spain. I think arguably is still Barcelona. Yeah, it's an incredible tennis city, and I would say the mecca for tennis in one of the great tennis cities in the world. But partly because of those two guys, they set down their roots, and they built they built players out of Barcelona. So those two guys are working within like a 30-minute drive of each other for decades, just producing champions. It's incredible.
And Bruguera's still at it, right?
Bruguera is, I don't want to say he's semi-retired. He's still working. I just saw him this summer, and he's getting older. I'm worried about his health. And I'm good friends with him. I studied with him for many years. He has his academy unfortunately closed. They had some I don't know what's going. There may be some financial difficulties during the pandemic, and I'm really sad actually. The academy in the hills of the Barcelona suburbs is closed now, and they have a new academy called Bardo Competition, which he's affiliated with. But his original academy that he started, I think, in 1986, is closed now, sadly. And Pato Alvarez passed away last year. So these Luis Bruguera may not be with us much longer, and those two guys are the driving force behind Spanish tennis, the original guys.
But now you have all of these academies in Spain. I mean, I know this partially just from my own personal experience because my son attends one in Mallorca.
Where's he train at?
Well, he goes to global. Do you know global tennis?
I know Joffrey really well. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you're talking about suffering.
Yeah, Joffrey's. If you enroll him there, then he must like to work. He must like to suffer.
Yeah, well, what's interesting about our son is that he grew up in Shanghai in China, and he went to a Chinese public school, which, suffering academically is a big thing in China.
Mm-hmm.
And so he was used to kind of the methods that Joffrey employs as far as
I send a lot of players to Joffrey, but I only send my players who are soldiers. And if it's interesting, you mentioned Asia. In Asia, they love the Spanish method, and in Spain, Spanish coaches have been sharing their system with Asian countries, and it's one of the reasons why you see a rise in Asian players. They've been training. They've been heavily influenced by Spanish coaches. Like Luis Bruguera has spent a lot of time in China, and Juan Carlos Ferrero's academy also, and Emilio Sanchez has been working a lot in China. So that is also an interesting segue or link. The rise of Asian tennis, and they love the Spanish method. Maybe for some of the reasons you alluded to, they like to suffer, they like the repetition, they like the work. So that connection is very strong between Asia and Spain.
Yeah, I immediately liked Joffrey just because the idea he has of every player has one ball, and you do not get any more balls, and you have to if you hit that ball somewhere else, you got to go fetch it. You're not going to get a bucket of balls, and they're constantly hitting. There's no downtime.
Yeah,
and it was constant.
Guys like Joffrey and Tony Nadal, and even to a certain Antonio Cascales is another guy I think you should probably interview. Especially in relation to Alcaraz, and now Juan Carlos Ferrero, and many other coaches who are successful in Spain are kind of the next wave or two following Luis Bruguera and Pato Alvarez. That's how I would describe it and explain it. They're the second wave that then they learned from, either directly or indirectly, from Luis Bruguera and Pato Alvarez. And the teaching method of Luis Bruguera, the methods of Bruguera and Alvarez were adopted by the Spanish Federation. So every coach was kind of indoctrinated. If you got a Spanish tennis license in this country, you had to learn the methods of Luis Bruguera and Pato Alvarez. They were in charge of the Spanish Federation at different times themselves. So whether you were a big fan of Bruguera or Alvarez and you happened to study with them yourself, or you took Spanish coaching courses back in the 80s and 90s, you were basically learning the methods and philosophy of Luis Bruguera and Pato Alvarez. And so you see a big wave coming after. So they developed a lot of good players themselves. But then you see the second and third waves coming from coaches who are using many of the methods and the techniques and following the philosophy of those two figures. So I just see those two figures as dominant in Spain in so many ways.
Yeah, no, that's what it sounds like. So let's talk about Alcaraz, because Alcaraz comes at a very interesting time. Rafa Nadal is at the end of his career. He is still very much suffering because he's suffering through so many injuries every tournament. But then you've got this guy who just seemed to come out of nowhere, and he plays definitely a Spanish method of tennis. But as you hinted before, he's not doing this consistent type of tennis where you don't make errors. He just goes for it. He tries to just hit out almost on every shot.
Yeah, he embodies many of the original secrets that I talked to you about of Spanish tennis, but he also breaks the mold. He's an iconoclast. He's different, and that's what's really unique and interesting about him. Is he has many of the Spanish aspects in his personality and character, but also something different. Where, like you said, he's more aggressive, and that's rare in Spain. And he's new, and he he's transforming what it means to be a Spanish player right in front of our eyes, and he's a great role model for young kids in Spain. The system in Spain is going to be changing. Everything I just told you is going to be changing somewhat because of this guy. He's so dynamic, he's so charismatic, and other players and coaches in Spain are bound to kind of follow the kind of his style in some respects. And the real testament to Juan Carlos Ferrero and Antonio Cascales, who are brilliant coaches themselves. Obviously, Juan Carlos Ferrero was #1 player in the world.
Yeah.
And what the job that they've done with Alcaraz in Vienna, in the little town in near Alicante, that academy is incredible. It's a small little academy built around Juan Carlos Ferrero's house. It's
really?
His estate. It's basically his estate in the farmlands. It's in the fields, in the farmlands outside of this just, small town, Vienna. There's nothing there. It's in the middle of nowhere.
Wow.
And and this little place has produced 2 #1 players in the world, which is very difficult to do, by the way. Juan Carlos Ferrero and now Alcaraz. And Antonio Cascales he's different than Luis Bruguera and Pato Alvarez. He's very quiet and humble. They're very humble, and he's non-assuming. But this guy's really a brilliant, and he's a genius. And he's been quietly producing players in that part of Spain for decades. And he's he's a quiet force behind Alcaraz, along with Juan Carlos Ferrero. Those two work in tandem. And so Alcaraz plays differently. He's very aggressive. I would say sometimes when I watch him, I can't believe he's a Spanish player, because he breaks that mold of making errors. Historically in Spain, I don't know what's going to happen to the Spanish system as it used to be, because Pato Alvarez, Luis Bruguera, coaches for decades really stress not making errors, not giving your opponent any free points. And Alcaraz, sometimes when I watch him, I can't believe it, how many errors he allowed. Juan Carlos Ferrero lets him play like that. And it's very anti-Spanish to make errors sometimes the way he does. But on the other hand, he embodies some of the great aspects historically of Spanish tennis. He's a great fighter. He's in great physical condition. He's a beautiful mover. He has a really big forehand weapon. So he has some of those parts, but his personality is a little bit different. There have been a few players like that in Spain over the years who are aggressive. There have been a few serve-and-volleyers in Spanish tennis history. Not many though. So he's different, but he's also the same. He's a very interesting study.
So in some ways, he's evolving this kind of method. In some ways, like he's taking it the next step forward.
Single-handedly, he's changing what it means to be a Spanish player, quote unquote. But he's also he also represents the philosophy and method system of Antonio Cascales. You have to look at the people who shape these players, the coaches, and the system of Antonio Cascales and Juan Carlos Ferrero. Juan Carlos Ferrero was Cascales' student, and those two working together in Vienna, in the little in the middle of nowhere in Vienna. They have a method that is not as rigid. It's very flexible. It is common sense, and it pulls from different methods in Spain. So it's if you go there, you'll see some of the drills of Luis Bruguera, some of the drills of Pato Alvarez. It's kind of a hybrid system, and it's flexible. It's open, and I think that coaching system allowed and still allows for a player like Alcaraz to flourish, to develop. Someone who wants to be a little different, attack more, take the ball on the rise more.
Right.
And that is, I think that is a testament to the open-mindedness of a coach like Antonio Cascales, and the willingness to think for the future. Juan Carlos Ferrero is definitely a big thinker about what's the future of Spanish tennis, what's the future of Spanish tennis players. For example, they want players to be more all-court oriented. They want players to be good on hard courts, not just clay court players. And there are other academies too looking forward like that.
That's really interesting that, like, how you mentioned how Ferrero is thinking about these things. I mean, he does seem like a more cerebral coach, like someone who's actually thinking outside the box, who's looking forward, who's sort of trying to see the bigger picture.
Right. And I think the way he coaches is he's completely shaped by Antonio Cascales. So those two minds are interlinked. Together, yeah. They're like a team. And so that willingness to look to the future, the willingness to let a player, like, he lets Alcaraz play. He lets him do that. I think Pato Alvarez and Alcaraz would have had a divorce quite quickly. There's no way that Alvarez would allow him to play the way he does. It would be shocking, or Luis Bruguera probably. I mean, Luis Bruguera is pretty open-minded in some respects, but basically not in the respect of making errors. You cannot, in the typical Spanish model, you cannot make errors. You cannot give your opponent any free points, and so this is a new style.
That's a fascinating observation. I mean, I'm curious. The one thing I noticed, seeing my own son play with at Global with Joffrey, and then the way that his trainer prefers to train here in Germany is that, at least in Germany, there tends to be an emphasis on individual training versus group. Where Joffrey's doing a lot of group trainings. Is there one that's better in the eyes of Spaniards?
So in Germany, there's a stress on private training.
Totally, yes,
that's
absolutely.
Interesting.
There's almost like an adverse reaction to group training. They love to do this individual stuff.
Yes, there's a big difference culturally across different countries. The U.S. is very private lesson centered as well. In Spain, one of the first things I noticed, I've been studying there almost 20 years now, and back in the early 2000s when I started visiting there, they really didn't do private lessons at all. And you couldn't get a private lesson. And the first U.S. families, I coach a lot of U.S. families that I sent there, or started traveling to Spain for training, they were it was kind of a conflict, because they came and they're like, hey, how can I get a private? And the Spanish just kind of looked at them quizzically, like, we don't do that. We don't do privates. And that was back in the day where the academy landscape in Spain was not as commercialized, not as monetized as it is now. Unfortunately, there's been a big trend in to sell Spanish academies and train, unfortunately. But back in the day, everyone was keeping it real, in the late 90s, early 2000s. And you just couldn't get a private. You want a private Luis Bruguera, he'd just say no. Or Pato Alvarez did some private work with the players that were part of his team that he was traveling with, but he did some privates. But there's a philosophy in Spain that you don't need a private lesson. Luis Bruguera was very anti-private, and he believed that if you come, and he was a huge influence in Spain. So Luis Bruguera, he used to tell me, no, we don't do that. We won't do that. And then it's interesting, as the decades went on, you get closer to the present. All the academies offer privates now in Spain if you request it. It's changed because they're responding to the demand of the client, and they're trying to run a business now more than before. And so now, if you go to Spain, you can request privates, and Emilio Sanchez Academy offers a private option if you're training in groups and so on and so forth. So that's been a big change in Spain. So now privates are available typically, but originally. Big figures in Spain like Luis Bruguera would argue that you don't need a private. We're going to put two players on the court. Our ratio is going to be very high quality. So originally every lesson in Spain, every group was typically two players per court. That's part of the Spanish system. It comes from Luis Bruguera and Pato Alvarez, that quality. And you still see that in a lot of the academies in Spain, 2 players per court. So when you have 2 players in a group, you can make a good argument. You don't need a private, because every group, I mean, even at like BTT at Barcelona Total Tennis, they're famous for 2 players per court, 2 players per coach, and the quality is very high. And you don't need private lessons. Here in the U.S., a lot of the groups are 4 players, sometimes more per coach, and that's too much. And then you have to sell a lot of private lessons because you put so many kids into a group, and the group is not that high quality. I don't know if the same thing happens in Germany or not. But
yeah, it's like a hybrid. I mean, you have clubs here, of course, and they have trainers at the clubs that belong to the clubs and are paid by the clubs, and so they run their own teams, and so you get that type of training, and so that's the group training. But then most of the serious players have their own individual trainer, and sometimes that individual trainer does not belong to that club, and they're somewhere else. At least that's the case with my son and a lot of people that we know here.
But essentially, you've touched on the important theme in Spanish, that no single training. Usually, small group training is enough to build a champion.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's interesting. Hey, this has been fascinating. Thanks so much. I think we're going to one thing that we touched on already a little. You touched on it talking about Ferrero. And how he trains, but I'm curious. Obviously Spaniards are better on clay. How are they training? You mentioned that Ferrero is starting to train in a different way. He's training for hard court and different surfaces. Yeah. How are they doing that? Like is that easy to do in Spain?
Yeah, it started in the early 2000s again. In the last 2 decades, Spain is rapidly transforming itself, and they're competing. Like I said, these elite federations around the world, they're all competing with each other. They're all trying to steal methodology or steal, from each other's systems. And so Spain, couple decades ago, just started. They literally all the academies started building hard courts. They all have them now. When I first started traveling in Spain, most of the academies were primarily clay, red clay. And if you go to Spain now, typically you see half and half at most of the places. Joffre's academy is an exception. It doesn't have hard courts. I think he's actually at a competitive disadvantage, the fact that he doesn't have hard courts, because most of the academies in Spain have that now, and they have easy access to hard courts. And I think he probably loses players actually because of his facility, because parents want both. And you contrast Joffre to, let's say, Tony Nadal, who's close in Mallorca. And that academy is heavily hard court based. In fact, in the beginning, they built only hard courts, which was a huge disappointment for many people who visited there. They said, "We come to train at Rafa's academy, and there's no clay courts for us to train on." And so they had a huge blowback. Like when the academy first opened, they had huge blowback. There was a lot of complaints, and finally they just gave up and built a ton of red clay courts. Because it's a funny story, because apparently Rafa's father, he didn't like the mess. The clay gets on everything. I own 2 clay courts here at my club. It gets on everything. So his dad literally didn't want the clay getting everywhere and ruining the sparkling facility. And so they just built hard courts. That's part of the story. And so,
but I mean, that's a good point, right? It does get everywhere. If you have, as a parent,
well, Rafa's he's kind of meticulous. Like he likes everything spotless.
He
if
is
you go,
meticulous.
you go to the academy. So they didn't want clay. They didn't want the kids tracking the clay everywhere.
Yeah.
And then, but
he's got that OCD thing going.
Yeah,
on,
and then exactly. And then so Tony Nadal, they tried to pass it off, and everyone came, and everyone was disappointed. Like, there's no clay courts here. My son played all week on hard, and they said, well, the Pro Tour, it's mostly hard court based now, and they tried very hard to convince the early people who visited there, and finally they just gave up and built a lot of red clay. So it's a good story, but all the academies are doing that now. Some of them have more clay or less, but
right.
So everybody has both now, and all the kids are playing on both. But it's interesting. Even you started that question by saying Spanish players are known for being better on clay. That everything's being turned on its head, because you could argue that Alcaraz might be better on hard. And he may change the definition of how we think about Spanish players being being better on clay, because I think if you ask his coaching team, they might say he's better on hard, even though he's very good on clay.
Wow, that's interesting. Okay, I think